was a great salesman by the name of Dave, whose boss couldn't quite understand how Dave could connect so well with the customer. So he said he wanted to go out with Dave. He wanted to know how Dave made out so well. And Dave told him that, well, boss, he says, I know everybody. Positively know everybody. He says, name somebody. So the boss come up with a movie star, great movie star. And Dave says, sure, I know him. He says, look, let's go out to California and we'll visit him. So they fly out to California and they knock on the door, and the guy in his home and what have you. And the guy shows up and opens the door and says, Dave, where have you been? I haven't seen you in a coon's age. What's happened to you? Come on in, we'll have a drink. And so they go in, they have a little conversation, they do the thing, and the boss, when they come out after their visit, the boss says to Dave, Dave, you could get lucky. He says, I understand. You could get lucky almost with anybody, but he says, I'm not convinced. And Dave says, well, name somebody else. And the boss sits there and he says, well, how about George Bush? This was during George Bush's presidency. Oh, yeah, he says, I know George. He says, well, come on, let's go to Washington. We'll get down there and get to see him. So they get down there and they get in a tour line because, as Dave told him, he says, look, he says, he's tough to get through all his security and everything. So he says, I have to go work my way through this way. So while he's there in line waiting for George Bush, doesn't George Bush walk through? And he looks up and he says, Dave, where have you been? I haven't seen you. And he says, I can't remember the last time. He says, come on up to my personal quarters and we'll have a cup of coffee together. So they go upstairs, they have a cup of coffee, conversation and what have you. And they come out a little later, they come downstairs and the boss says to him, Dave, he says, I don't know, but he says, it could happen twice. You could get lucky twice. He says, but he says, I don't quite buy it. And Dave says, name somebody else. He says, name somebody else. And the boss thinks a minute and he says, the Pope. Dave says, the Pope? He goes, oh, he says, I know him. He says, you want to meet him? He says, we'll go to Rome together. So they fly over to Rome, and they get there, and Dave says they're outside the place where the balcony is, and Dave says, look, he says, I'll have to work my way out. He says, I know all these Swiss guards and everything. He says, I have to work my way in. He says, but you stay right here under the balcony and watch up there. So he excuses himself, goes by, and pretty soon the boss is looking up, and Dave walks out on the balcony with the Pope. And Dave looks down, sees the boss, smiles at him, and what have you. The boss faints dead away. And Dave excuses himself and says, for the Pope, and he goes downstairs, and by this time the meds are bringing the boss back, and the boss is coming alive, and Dave says, boss, he says, what happened to you? He says, I saw you pass out down here. The boss says, Dave, you won't believe this. He says, but I'm standing there looking at you and the Pope up there. He says, and this guy next to me nudges me and says, hey, who's the guy with the Pope? Who's the guy with Dave? Sorry, I screwed that up. Who's the guy with Dave? End of joke.
Yeah. That's great.
End of joke.